to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories. We have stories that should thrill you a little and chill you a little.
It's amazing.
You will hear adventures sent in by you guys, classic stories from the pulp mags, and episodes from the golden age of radio. We have special segments like Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
That's amazing.
And Paranormal Expeditions.
I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
So settle in for the next hour and enjoy the show. Oh, and you just might want to prepare yourself to be taken away from today.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by music. Music gives a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything. Plato said that.
And I will wager that it has nothing to do with our mystery.
That would be true.
Attention, Motorcycle Patrol 14. Attention, Motorcycle Patrol 14. Go immediately to Whaleback Beach. Body has been reported found on shore. Attention, Motorcycle Patrol 14.
Hey, you! What are you doing down there? I'm the one who called the police. The body's down here.
I'll be right down. Now wait there.
Take your time. That hill's pretty steep.
Is he dead?
I'm afraid so. I've been trying to bring him around.
Well, who is he?
A neighbor of mine, John Rawlings.
What's your name?
William Sanders. I live up the beach about a mile. Rawlings has the cottage next to mine.
What's happened here?
Well, I'd just come in with my boat when I saw Rawlings sprawled on the sand. From the looks of him, he must have been in the water for several hours, as he had several strings of weed clinging to his wet clothes. I've been working on him while waiting for you.
Well, he's gone, all right.
Poor Rawlings. I don't quite know how to break it to his wife.
Mr. Sanders, where did you say you had been this afternoon?
You mean when I discovered the body?
Well, before that.
Well, I was out sailing all afternoon. I usually come in about 5 o'clock each afternoon, but since it was such a warm day, I made it an hour later.
You were out all afternoon, then?
Yes, that's right. This evening, when I was sailing in, making for my anchor buoy, I noticed what seemed to be a body lying on the beach. I anchored the ship and rowed in with my little boat that I keep tied up to the buoy.
Where do you keep the rowboat when you're on shore?
Oh, I also keep it out there. This line here, attached to the cliff, goes out to the buoy, and after I row in, I use the line to pull the rowboat back out to the water. That's to keep the tides from smashing it on the rocks.
You say you rowed right into the beach?
Yes. Rawlings was lying high up on the sand. He must have been washed in by the high tide and left there when it ran out.
How far out do you keep your sailboat?
Well, when it's high tide, it's about 100 yards offshore.
And at low tide?
I should say about 50. When I came into shore tonight, it was only necessary for me to row in that distance, as it had been low tide for about 4 hours.
Well, that'll be sufficient, Mr. Sanders. I've enough for my report.
It's been a horrible accident.
No, Mr. Sanders, you mean murder.
What?
I repeat, murder. And I'm holding you as the killer.
What flaw did the policeman discover in William Sanders' story that brands him as the murderer? In just a moment, we'll know, but first...
Okay, I'll bite. What was the slip-up? Frankly, the story seems plausible to me.
I think it might have something to do with the timing.
Are you thinking maybe the tides?
No, that can't be it.
Then there must be something that they didn't tell us.
The clues are there. If you were paying attention, you listen, but you do not observe.
Are you suggesting that I missed something?
Indubitably.
Okay then, fill me in, Sherlock.
I suggest we allow the good officer to do that.
Fine.
And now, back to our story.
Mr. Sanders, your story contained one glaring contradiction that turned it into a confession of guilt. You told me that the body was wet when you found it. Yet just a moment ago, you admitted that the tide had been out for about 4 hours, thus leaving the body lying on the beach for that length of time in the summer sun. If Rawlings' body were wet, as you claimed you found it, It's because you just put it there, after first drowning your victim. Sorry, Mr. Sanders, but your story sailed off course that time. Your alibi is on the rocks.
Okay, I would like to point out that it was the tide.
However, you missed the wet clothing and the hot sun.
True, but the tide was right.
Yes, it was.
Thank you. This 5-minute mystery was brought to you by music. Music is the strongest form of magic.
Is that you said?
Welcome to the podcast. Sometimes stories take hold of you and you just get lost in them. That's what we hope to do here on the show each week. This time, we have an NDE adventure from Chad and a story from Darren that just might have you believing in the paranormal, or at least wanting a shave and a haircut. Stay tuned for that. Our featured story is engaging, to say the least. It's about a dog and a boy and an event that occurred 800 years ago. The cool part is that it's read for us by our old friend Mark Nelson. We end the program with a history lesson from ancient Egypt, circa 1152 BC. I love the emails I get, and sometimes they lead to something you might not know about me. Here is an email from Becky Grant. Sorry, but Becky didn't tell us where she hails from. Hey Ron, I listen to the show every week and I love your voice. It has a calming effect that is, well, paranormal. I would like to know if you sing. Is music part of what you do? Thank you for what you do and don't stop believing. Do you get the reference? Becky. Well, I do get the reference, and I too am a Journey fan from way back. Steve Perry's voice has the same effect on me. His calming tones can take the stress right out of a person. As for music, I do have a background in it all the way back to high school. In fact, I was in a band for a short time called US, which stood for United Spirit Band. I didn't sing much, but I did play some keyboards and the trombone. Those were some good times. Today, I limit my music to playing around with GarageBand loops and some original melodies.
Ron, can I suggest you give us a sample?
Oh, I couldn't do that. It would be, well, pretentious.
But you will do it.
If you insist. Here is a tune that I call Ron's Beat. That one is a collection of Apple loops with some original keyboard work. I trend my music more towards atmospheric and ambient creations, but they would probably bore the heck out of you. Thank you for your question, Becky. Last week on the podcast, I presented a story from the OTR series, Buck Rogers. I asked for your feedback on this one via a poll, which can be found on the blog site. At the time of this recording, 7 folks have responded. The poll will be open until April 15th, so please just take a minute and fill it out. I would greatly appreciate it. I will have a link to it in the show notes. One last thing before we get on with the show this week, I'm looking for stories about time slips and lost time events. If you have one of these, please send it to me. I plan to use them on the 500th episode. You can use the contact tab or the story submission banner located on ronsamazingstories.com. Thank you. Now let's get on with things with this one from Audible. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/RonsAmazingStories. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, computer, Kindle, whatever you have, you probably can listen to Audible on it. So what am I listening to right now? The Singularity Trap by Dennis E. Taylor. It's brought to life by the award-winning narrator, Ray Porter. The Singularity Trap is a thrilling adventure full of drama and action on a truly cosmic scale. Ivan Pritchard was determined to give his wife and children a better life back home. He ventures to the edge of known space to join the crew of the Mad Astra as an asteroid miner. Here is a sample from the book.
1 minute to launch.
Ivan gripped the chair arms even tighter. The pain in his fingers penetrated his panic, and he struggled to unclench his hands and slow his breathing. He looked at the arms of his blue coverall, relieved that the cloth was still dry. If he couldn't get a grip soon, the sight of a sopping wet uniform would only encourage the other crew members to more of what they apparently thought was witty commentary. And anyway, his funk made no logical sense. The sling had been launching shuttles into orbit with no major incidents for almost 40 years. Technically, this was safer than air travel. And he was going into space. This should be fun. Hey, noob. You aren't going to have a jammer, are you? Ivan glanced to his left at Tennyson Davies, sitting across the center aisle. Ten, a beefy, florid Texan, was a veteran of asteroid mining, returning for his 10th tour. In fact, every one of the crew signed on with the Mad Astra had at least 4 previous tours with the mining ship. Everyone except himself and Arcadius Geiger. And KD looked like he was falling asleep. Show off. Ivan and his fellow crew members sat together, taking up 2 complete rows. He could see groups from several other ships, all wearing similar utility coveralls, also heading up in preparation for a 6-month mining tour. The coveralls, standard issue items probably made by a single company, were identical, except for the ship insignia on the left breast. The Mad Astra crew wore a stylized image of a hand reaching for a star. Several clunks and a shudder ran through the shuttle, and Ivan renewed his death grip. He half expected to hear a squeal of bending metal from the chair's arms. A faint whiff of flop sweat assaulted his nostrils, and he realized he was again losing the battle with panic.
15 seconds,
the PA intoned. Ivan closed his eyes and tried deep breathing exercises again. Too late to back out now. Even if he unbuckled and ran screaming for the exit, The shuttle would launch on schedule with him plastered to the rear bulkhead. 3 months of training and simulations, which had felt like an adventure of its own, now seemed nothing more than wishful thinking. He was about to be shot into the air in a tin can with no say in his fate. Not even a view of space for the next 15 minutes. "Relax, noob," said Davies. "We haven't lost a crew member in weeks." The veteran miner grinned at Ivan, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. He looked more like a cat anticipating a meal than someone offering reassurance. Ivan opened his mouth to retort, but at that moment the sling kicked in. His body was pressed into his seat as the shuttle accelerated down the track. It would continue for the entire 5-kilometer stretch of the launch tunnel, air resistance reduced by massive pumps that pulled the air from in front of the shuttle and pumped it back in behind. The occasional moan floating up the aisle showed that he wasn't the only person having trouble. He tried to extract a small kernel of solace from that shared misery. Thankfully, this part of the takeoff was smooth. Nothing like the old space launches, perched on top of an explosive cylinder of fuel, being rattled so hard you felt your teeth would fall out through your ears. Ivan concentrated on his breathing and on not whimpering in fear. He hadn't been tagged with a nickname yet, and he sure as hell didn't want to provide the crew with that kind of material to work with. Certainly not before he'd even left atmosphere.
Does that sound interesting? It should, because getting into space was only the beginning. Ivan is prepared for hard work and loneliness, but not the unthinkable. After coming into contact with a mysterious alien substance, Pritchard finds an unwelcome entity sharing his mind and a disturbing physical transformation taking place. With his very humanity at stake, Pritchard must save mankind from full-scale interstellar war. The storyline is incredible. The author, Dennis E. Taylor, describes himself as a computer programmer by day, writer by night, and a snowboarder in season. With the phenomenal success of The Singularity Trap, he now devotes himself full-time to writing science fiction. Now, you can have his book today. Here's what Audible has set up for us. Audible is offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you too can get your copy of The Singularity Trap today. Thank you, Audible. And now it's time for your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
This story comes from Chad Campbell of Chicago, Illinois. Chad writes, "Hello, Ron. I have a story for you. Many years ago, my family was getting back from vacation, and when we got home, my brother took the car and headed out with his girlfriend. Since we had just gotten home from a long trip, my mother decided to do a load of laundry. She headed downstairs with a basket of clothes and got them going. As she left the laundry room, she saw a tall, dark shadow figure standing at the end of the hallway. Terrified, she ran upstairs and found my dad. As soon as they started down the stairs, she got a call. My brother had gotten into an accident and was being taken to the hospital. A few days after surgery and some recovery, my brother and his girlfriend were talking about what had happened. They had been driving near the river, were distracted, and crashed into the bridge railing. The car nearly went into the river, but thankfully it hung on. He said, 'Mom, I saw you at the crash.' Confused, my mom asked what he meant. He said, 'I saw you, standing there. You had a laundry basket in your hands.' He didn't remember anything else until he woke up in the ambulance heading down the road. He remembered he turned his head to look around, and then his already broken neck gave out. He was resuscitated on the way to the emergency room. We were told that he was dead for almost a full minute. He was able to describe the clothes in the laundry basket that my mom was holding. It was insane. He made a full recovery and hasn't crashed a car since, although he still is an idiot driver. Chad Campbell, Chicago, Illinois. Near-death experiences are strange. No matter what, there's always something unique and different about each and every one. Yours is no different. Thank you for your story, Chad. It truly is amazing. This next story is a short one from Darren Platt of Texas. Darren sent this in via email and kind of follows the idea in Chad's story. He has titled it Grandpa's Last Wish and wanted everyone to know that he did not believe in the paranormal until now. He, however, loved scary stories, even if he thought they were all fake. Hey Ron, thank you for sharing and reading our stories. I have this one for you. My grandfather passed away on a Friday night after a long battle with lung cancer. He was alert and happy up until the very end. He told us that when he goes, he will come back for a visit so that we'll all know he was okay. The following night, I was at home with my kids. My wife was out shopping. There was a knock on the front door. I went to see who it was, and there was no one there. The thing was, it was a strange type of knock. My grandpa always called it shave and a haircut. I went back to playing with my girls when it came again. This time I ran to the door and opened it quickly. I swear by all that is good and holy, floating there was a bright blue orb. It wavered around a bit and then vanished. That's it. I can't explain it, but I know it was my grandpa. I just know it. Darren Platt, Texas. Well, Darren, there's no need to explain. What a great story, and for those who don't know, a shave and a haircut and the associated response, 2 bits, is a 7-note musical call-and-response couplet, riff, or fanfare properly used at the end of a musical performance, usually for comic effect. An early occurrence of the tune is from an 1899 Charles Hale song, At a Darktown Cakewalk. Thank you for your story, Darren. Well, that's it for this time. If you have a story that you want to share, like Darren did, head to the main website at ronsamazingstories.com and click on the story submission banner. Leave your story, give it a title, and tell me where you're from. I'll read it if I can. Our featured story is captivating. It first appeared in Galaxy Science Fiction in February of 1955. It's not like anything we've had before. It presents a picture of the future that probably represents what space travel and planet hopping will be like. It was written by William Morrison and is read for us by our old friend, Mark Nelson. The story is titled Dead Man's Planet. When a driven man arrives at a cemetery world, what else can it be but the journey's end and the start of a new one?
Outside the ship, it was the sun that blazed angrily. Inside, it was Sam Wilson's temper. "Study your lessons," he snarled, with a savageness that surprised himself, "or I'll never let you set foot on this planet at all." "Okay, Pop," said Mark, a little white around the nostrils. He looked old for so young a kid. "I didn't mean anything wrong."
"I don't care what you meant. You do as you're told."
In the quiet that followed, broken only by the hum of the arithmetic tape, Sam wondered at himself. As kids went, Mark had never been a nuisance. Certainly, Rhoda had never had any trouble with him, but Rhoda had been altogether different. Sam was tough, and he had always got a sense of satisfaction out of knowing that he was hard-boiled, or at least that was once true. Rhoda had been sweet, gentle. He aroused himself from thoughts of her by calling, "Mark." "Yes, Pop?" His voice had been harsher than he had intended. Over the past few weeks, he seemed gradually to have been losing control of it. Now, although he was going to do his son a favor, he sounded like a slave-master threatening a beating. "You can shut off your arithmetic lesson. We're going out." "But didn't you want me—"
"I changed my mind."
Mark seemed more troubled than pleased, as if a father who changed his mind so readily was a man to be wary of. "I'm on the edge all the time," thought Sam, "and I'm getting him that way too. I have to regain control of myself." He had long ago made all the necessary tests for such possible dangers as lack of oxygen and the presence of infectious organisms. On all counts, the planet had passed muster. The sun, whiter than Sol, was almost hot enough to make him forget the chill he carried deep inside him. Almost, but not quite, especially as the air, though breathable, was thin and deficient in nitrogen. The countryside was bleak, inspiring in him the thought that there are two kinds of desolation, the one that precedes the coming of man, and the one which he knows only too well how to create wherever he goes. The desolation here was non-human. It's like a cemetery, ain't it, Pop?" Sam looked at his son sharply. Kids of 10 were not supposed to know much about cemeteries. Nor, for that matter, were kids of 6, Mark's age, when the funeral had taken place. Sam hadn't let him attend, but evidently the incident had made a deeper impression on his mind than Sam had realized. He would always remember a cemetery as the place where his mother lived. Perhaps he missed Rhoda almost as much as his father did. "It's different from a cemetery," said Sam. "There's nobody buried here. Looks like we're the first human beings ever to set foot on this place." "Do you think we'll find animals to catch, Pop?" "I don't see signs of any animals." That was part of Sam's private fiction, that he was looking for strange animals to be sold to zoos or circuses. Actually, he was seeking less to find anything new than to lose something he carried with him, and succeeding in neither attempt. Mark shivered in the sun. "It's kind of lonely," he said. "More lonely than the ship?" "It's different. It's bigger, so it's more lonely." "I'm not so sure," argued Sam mentally. "In the ship, we have all of space around us, and nothing's bigger than that. Still, your opinion has to be respected. You're almost as great an expert on the various kinds of loneliness as I am. The difference is that you're loneliest when you're away from people. I'm loneliest in a crowd. That's why I don't mind this planet so much." He walked ahead, Mark following almost reluctantly. The ground was rocky, and the shrub-like vegetation sparse and stunted, ranging in color from greenish-gray to brown. It seemed hardly capable of supporting a large animal population. If there were any animals here at all, they were probably too small to be impressive, and would be of little interest to exhibitors. They walked in silence for a few moments, and then Sam asked, "Want to go on?" "I want to finish my studying." That was something new. "Okay," said Sam, and turned back. They were approaching the ship when the sound of a pebble falling came to Sam's ears. Automatically, his hand reached for his gun, and he swung around to face what might be danger. As he did so, something snarled and fled. He could see no sign of motion, but he could hear the scattering of other pebbles along a gully as the creature retreated. "Looks like we're not alone here after all," he said. "Wonder what that was." "It couldn't have been very big," said Mark. "Big animals don't run away." "Not usually, unless they're smart, or they've met people before. I'll have to set traps." "Do you think maybe if you caught him you could sell him to a circus, Pop?" "I'll have to see what he's like first," said Sam. He looked around. "If there's one animal, there are likely to be others. It's strange that I didn't detect any sign of them." He put his arm absently over Mark's shoulder. He didn't notice the expression on the kid's face at this unexpected gesture. When they were inside the ship again, Mark said, "Guess I'd better get back to my arithmetic." "In a minute," said Sam. "I want to talk to you first." He dropped wearily into his seat, although he had done nothing that should have tired him out. His son looked at him expectantly. "Mark, do you like traveling around with me?" "Sure, Pop. I'd like to be with you." "Not seeing anybody else? No other kids? No people of any kind? Just being with me, learning your lessons from tapes, having your test papers corrected automatically? You don't get tired of it?" Mark hesitated despite himself. Then he said loyally, "I'd rather be with you than anybody else. When Mom died, I didn't want to see anybody." "I know how you felt. But that was 4 years ago. You can't grow up alone. Now, what you need to do is meet people, learn how they talk and think and feel. You can't learn those things from tapes, and you can't learn them from me." Mark said stubbornly, "I'd like to be with you." "I'm not much of a person to be with. Don't think I don't know it. I'm mean and surly, and my temper's getting worse by the day. I can't associate with people anymore, but you can. I was thinking maybe I'd leave you—" "No!" cried Mark. "Not in an orphanage or anything like that. But I have some friends whose kids are growing up." "No! I won't go. If you send me, I'll run away. I want to be with you." "Okay," said Sam. "That's that." But it wasn't, and he knew it. Even as he went about preparing his traps, he knew it. As it turned out, the only animals he caught in his traps were small ones, which tore themselves in two and then scampered off, each half running in a different direction. For the animal which had made those noises, no traps were necessary. Later on, he heard a noise outside again, and he went out cautiously, gun in hand. The animal backed away, but he saw it. Then he heard it bark. So did Mark, who had followed him. Mark's eyes almost popped. It was 4 years since he had heard the sound, but he knew at once what it was. "Gosh, a dog! How do you suppose he got here?" "I don't know," said Sam. "Your guess is as good as mine." "But if we're the first human beings to land here, it ain't possible." "I know that. But there he is." At the sound of their voices, the dog broke into a series of furious barks, backing away as it did so. "What kind is he, Pop?" "He looks like a mongrel to me. A bad-tempered, medium-sized mongrel with an ugly look about him. Maybe I ought to shoot him and get it over with." "Shoot him? Don't do that. I want him as a pet." "He looks too wild to make much of a pet." The dog gave one last bark of defiance, turned, and fled in the same general direction, Sam noticed, as he had run last time. "Maybe dogs do grow on other planets, Pop." "Only if men have brought them there." "Then that means there was a ship here?" "At some time or other, there was a ship. I don't think it was smashed up, or I'd have seen the wreckage when I cruised around before landing. That dog was either left here by mistake, or deliberately marooned." Maybe he's with somebody who's still here." "Not likely," said Sam thoughtfully. "He wanders around too freely, and he seems unused to the presence of human beings. Besides, no men would be likely to live here long without shelter, and I've seen no sign of any house or hut." "Could he belong to a being that wasn't human?" "No," replied Sam with certainty. "Only human beings have been able to domesticate dogs. If a dog is here, a human being was once here. That's definite." "He would make a good pet," said Mark longingly. "Not that one. Maybe I should have got you a dog long ago. It might have been just the kind of companionship you needed. But you can't make a pet of this animal. He's been away from people too long, and he's developed some mean habits." And he added mentally, "like me." "I could train him," said Mark. "He wouldn't be any trouble at all, Pop. I'd train him and feed him, and he'd be just like one of us. And like you say, Pop, it wouldn't be so lonely for me." Kids don't give up easily, thought Sam. All the same, he had an idea that, with this dog, all the persistence in the world would be useless. He shrugged and said simply, "We'll see." And then they went into the ship to eat. All through the meal, he could tell that Mark was thinking about the dog. The boy's thoughts seemed to affect his appetite. For the first time, he left some of his Protein-X on the plate. "I'm not very hungry today," he said apologetically. "Maybe—" He looked inquiringly at his father. "Go ahead and finish it," said Sam. "We've got plenty of food. I'll fix up something else for the dog." "But I want to feed him myself, Pop. I want him to get used to me feeding him." "I'll give you your chance later." Afterwards, Sam thriftily opened an old can of a less expensive variety of Protein-X and put half of it on a platter, which Mark carried outside the ship. He moved off about 100 yards in the direction the dog had taken and set the platter down on a rock. "The wind is blowing the wrong way," said Sam. "Let's wait a while." In 10 minutes the wind shifted, and if the dog was near, Sam felt certain that he had picked up both their scent and that of the food. That his feeling was correct was shown by the sudden appearance of the animal, who barked again, but this time not so fiercely. And he stopped barking to sniff hungrily, at the same time keeping his distance. "Here, Mutt," called Mark. "I'm afraid he won't come any closer while we're around," said Sam. "If you want him to have that food, you'd better go away from it." Mark reluctantly backed away with his father. The dog approached the food, finally rushing down upon it as if he feared it would escape, and gobbled it. In the days that followed, they continued to feed him, and the animal became relatively tame. He stopped barking at them, and at times let Mark come within a few feet of him. But he never allowed Mark to come close enough to touch him, and he was especially wary of Sam. The latter could see, however, that there was nothing around the smooth furred neck. The collar, if it had ever existed, had evidently been worn away. "So we can't find out what his name is," said Mark in disappointment. "Here, Prince, here. Spot, here. Rover." The animal answered to none of the traditional dog names, nor to several of the newer ones that Mark recalled. After the dog had been with them for half an hour or so, he usually trotted off in the direction of what they had come to consider his lair. "He doesn't seem to be getting tame enough for a pet," said Sam. "That's one idea I'm afraid you'll have to give up." "All he needs is a little more time," said Mark. "He's getting used to me." Then a sudden fear struck him, and he added, "You're not going to leave here yet, are you, Pop? I thought you wanted to catch some big animals." "There aren't any other big animals," replied Sam. "Just those small ones who came apart in the traps, and they're not worth catching. But I'll stay. This place is as good as any other. I won't leave it yet." In fact, the stay on the planet, bleak as the place was, seemed to be less unpleasant than cruising aimlessly through space. Mark had been starved for companionship of someone besides his father, and in a way, without making too many demands, the dog was a companion. Wondering about the beast and trying to tame him gave them something with which to occupy their minds. It had been several days, realized Sam, since he had last snapped at Mark. It had become quite certain now that there was no other human being around. The dog's eagerness for the food showed that no one else had taken care of him for a long time. Evidently, he had been forced to feed himself on the small and elusive native animals which he could run down. One of the things that puzzled Sam was the dog's obvious anxiety to leave the neighborhood of the ship after a short period and return to his lair. And one day, driven by curiosity, Sam followed him, with Mark coming along too. The dog had become sufficiently accustomed to them by now not to resent their presence, and it was easy to keep him in sight. He led the way for at least 2 miles, over rocky ground and past a small stream. Quite unexpectedly, he stopped and began to whine and sniff the ground. As Sam and Mark approached, he turned on them, barking furiously. The man and boy exchanged glances. "He's acting just like he did in the beginning," said Mark. "There's something in the ground," said Sam. "I'm going to find out what it is." And he drew his gun. "You're not going to kill him, Pop?" "I'll just put him to sleep. An anesthetic pellet of the kind I used for trapping ought to do the trick." But one pellet turned out not to be enough. It required the bursting of 3 pellets before the animal finally trembled, came to a halt, and with eyes glazed, fell over on the ground. When they approached closer, Sam caught sight of a half a dozen stones, roughly piled together. He said, "Better get back, Mark. This may not be pleasant." You think somebody's buried here?" "Very likely. I'm going to see." Using a flat rock with a sharp edge as an improvised spade, he began to dig. The ground was hard, and the rock was not the best of tools. It took him half an hour to reach the first bone, and another half-hour to uncover the rest. Mark had come up behind him and was watching with no sign of revulsion. He said, I was afraid there might be a body, Pop." "So was I. It looks as if the man died so long ago that everything else has rotted away, except for a few metal clasps. No other sign of shoes or clothes, and no indication of how this happened." "You think he was the dog's master?" "Evidently." They both stared at the sleeping animal. Then Sam shrugged and began to fill the shallow grave again. Mark helped him push in the dirt and stamp it down into place. Finally, they moved the stones back. They were about to leave when Mark cried out, "Look at that rock!" Staring where his son pointed, he saw a great column about 4 feet high, with 4 smooth lateral sides. Rectangular prisms of this size were rare in nature. This was obviously the work of human hands, and of a blasting rod as well, to judge by the sides, which showed evidence of having been fused before weathering had cut into them. At first he had thought the column was a gravestone, but there was no inscription upon it. There was nothing but a thin, deep groove that ran horizontally around the 4 sides, several inches from the top. "What does it mean, Pop?" "Let's find out. It's obviously been put here as some sort of memorial. As for this groove—" He put his hands on top of the stone and lifted. As he had half expected, it separated at the horizontal groove. The top of the stone was the lid of a box. Inside lay a plastic container. "Some kind of plastic we don't make anymore," muttered Sam. "Aren't you going to open it?" asked Mark eagerly. "Maybe it tells about the grave and the dog's name." The plastic came open at a slight tug. Inside were several strong sheets of paper. Sam stared at them and said, "It's writing, sure enough, but in some language I don't understand." "We could put it in our mechanical translator," said Mark. "That can tell us what it means." "That's what we'll do." "Are we going to take the dog with us, Pop?" No, we'll leave him here. He'll come to in a little while." Walking back to their ship, Mark continued to show an excitement that was unusual for him. "You know what?" he said. "I'll bet we're going to learn what the dog's name is." "I doubt if whoever wrote this thing would bother with a trifle like that." "But that's important. You'll see, Pop, you'll see." At the ship, Sam inserted the sheets into the reader section of his translator and started the motor. The selector swung into action. "Before it can translate, it has to decide what language this is," he explained. "Will that take long?" "A few minutes if we're lucky, a couple of hours if we're not. After that, I think the translation itself shouldn't take more than a few minutes. While we're waiting, we might as well eat." "I'm not hungry," said Mark. "You'd better eat anyway." "Just a little bit, maybe. You know what I think, Pop? When I call the dog by his name, he'll know I'm his friend, and he'll come to me. Then he'll really be my pet." "Don't count too much on it," said Sam, and thought once more how lonely his son must be, to center so much hope in a half-wild beast. A light glowed suddenly in the translator. The selector had found the proper language. Now it began to translate. 20 minutes later, its work had been completed. As Sam silently began to read, Mark bumped against him, knocked the translation from his hand. Sam's first reaction was anger at the boy's clumsiness, then became aware of the hope and the fear that lay behind Mark's excitement, and bit back the angry words which had almost reached his lips. "Easy, Mark, easy," he said. He picked up the translation again and sat down. "You can read it over my shoulder if you want to." "I just want to find out the dog's name." "The important thing is his master's name. Julian Hagstrom, it says, and he was on a spaceship with his brother, Raoul." Mark's eyes had skipped ahead. "Look, Pop, here's the dog's name. Arkham. I never heard of a dog having a name like that. What does it mean?" "I wouldn't know," muttered Sam absently, still reading. But Mark wasn't actually interested in his answer. He ran outside. "Arkham!" he called. "Arkham!" There was nothing he could interpret as an answer. After a moment or two, he came into the ship again, his face betraying his disappointment. "I guess he doesn't hear me. He's too far away." Sam nodded. He put the translation down and was staring straight ahead of him, as if looking through the ship's side. "Is anything the matter, Pop?" "What? Oh, no, nothing's the matter. I was just thinking about what I read here." "They had an accident, didn't they? How did it happen?" "It happened because their ship wasn't as good as ours. Julian Hagstrom, the man who was killed, was buried here by his brother. Raoul put this record in the stone to mark his grave. I think he also engraved something on the stone itself, but that's been worn away." "It must have been a long time ago. Maybe years." "Yes, it was years ago. After he buried Julian, Raoul tried to make repairs and headed in a direction where he hoped he'd find a civilized planet. He never made it." "How can you know that? He wrote the paper before he started out." "If he had made it, we'd have heard of him. We'd certainly have heard of him." Sam's face was bleak. "And Rhoda, your mother, would still be alive." Mark looked puzzled, and stared at the translation once more. "It says here he tried to re-reverse the aging process. What does that mean? And what's immortality, Pop?" "Something he and his brother were looking for. Something to keep people from ever dying. They had a ship full of dogs and other animals. All died in their experiments, all but Arkham. They had high hopes of Arkham. He lived through a number of different treatments and became quite a pet of Julian's. Then came the crash. Their method wasn't proof against accidental death, and at any rate, they hadn't applied it yet to themselves. After Raoul buried his brother, the dog was miserable and howled so much that Raoul decided to leave him behind. He was helped to reach this decision by the fact that the ship had lost much of its air in the accident, and he knew that the air-purifying mechanism wasn't working too well. He figured he'd have a better chance of surviving if he stayed in the ship alone. But it didn't do him any good. He was lost in space, or we'd certainly have heard of him. From outside, there came the sound of a low growl.
"It's Arkham," cried Mark. "Now you'll see. Wait till he hears me call his name."
He ran out, and Sam followed slowly. "Don't expect too much, Mark," he said, almost with pity. Mark didn't hear him.
"Arkham," he called. "Arkham! Arkham!"
The dog was watchful, keeping his distance and giving no sign of recognition. Sam put his arm around his son's shoulder.
"Arkham! Arkham! Here, Arkham!"
The dog snarled. There were tears in the boy's eyes.
"He doesn't know his name. He doesn't even know his own name. Arkham!"
"It's no use, Mark. He's forgotten he ever had a name. I'm afraid you'd better give up the idea of having him as a pet."
"But you can't forget your own name."
"You can in 800 years. Yes, Mark, that's when all this happened, 800 years ago. That's why the language had to be translated. Arkham is immortal, and during his long life he's forgotten not only his name, but the master for whose sake he was marooned here. If Julian Hagstrom were, by some miracle, to come back to life, I'm sure the dog wouldn't remember him. All he has is a vague but strong tie to that heap of stones. He no longer knows why he's protecting it. He's been away from live human beings so long that his brain is little more than a bundle of reflexes and instincts."
"I'll train him," said Mark. "Sometimes you forget a thing at first, but it comes back to you later. He'll remember his name. Here, Arkham!"
"It's no use," said Sam. "For 800 years he's been tied to that heap of stones. He'll never remember anything except that fact. I'll get you another dog for a pet."
"You mean we're going back to Mars or Earth?"
"Some place like that. Some place where there are people. Being alone in space is no good for you."
"Oh, no, Pop. You can't get rid of me like that."
"I'm not trying to get rid of you," said Sam. "Being alone in space is no good for me either. I'm going with you."
"Gee, are you sure? You won't change your mind?"
The delighted but uncertain look on his son's face shook Sam. He said carefully, "I won't change my mind. I've decided that it's possible to have too much of a good thing, if grief is a good thing." Suddenly, for no reason that they could detect, the dog barked at them and backed away, the fur rising in an angry ridge along his back.
"Couldn't we take him along anyway?" asked Mark. "I don't like to think of him all alone here, year after year."
"He'll be miserable here, but he'd be more miserable away from his heap of dirt and stones." "Perhaps." Mark didn't see as Sam pulled his gun, and then let it slip back into place. "No, that's none of my business. Maybe he'll be fortunate and have an accident."
"What did you say, Pop?"
"Nothing much. Come along, Mark. We're heading for civilization." An hour later, the ship rose into the air. Through the blasting of the rockets, Sam thought, imagined he decided was a better word, that he heard the long, doleful whine of a creature whose mindless grief was doomed to last for all eternity.
The author of Dead Man's Planet is listed as William Morrison. I tried to find out about him, but couldn't find a single thing. I was about to give up when I found an obscure link to someone named Yosef Samashin. It turns out that this was his true name. A graduate of Rutgers University, he earned a PhD in chemistry from Yale at the age of 23. Comics and pulp magazine historian Jerry Bales wrote that Sam Mushin worked as a research chemist for the American Molasses Company until 1938, leaving to become a writer. I have no idea how successful he was.
Not so important times in history.
In this segment, we take a look at historical events that may otherwise go unnoticed. We look at history with a fish-eyed lens, giving a perspective that should provide no insight to anyone or any time. But it is historical, or hysterical, as the case may be. Join us now for this event in history. Going on strike, you would presume, is closely linked with the industrialization and the formation of trade unions. Wrong. While it was, of course, the industrialization of economies that led to better organized workforces, the idea of putting down your tools because of a dispute goes back a very long way indeed. The very first strike recorded in history started in 1152 BC on the 14th of November. It was during the reign of Ramses III in ancient Egypt. It is a common misconception, largely created by biblical stories, that much of the work on ancient Egyptian monuments was carried out by slaves. While Egyptians did indeed have slaves, they were by no means the main workforce. Craftsmen, builders, and haulers were paid men who took pride in their work. This was evidenced by the quality of the structures, many which have stood for more than 3,000 years. In November of 1152 BC, trouble was brewing during the construction of a royal necropolis, which was a group of tombs and crypts. The workers felt that they were being underpaid and their wages were promised but never provided. So they organized a mass walkout, halting construction. The response was very interesting. You might assume that the pharaohs would bring out the whips or cut the heads off the ringleaders of the strike, but after a discussion, the artisans' wages were paid, and in fact, their wages were actually increased. The workers returned to finish the job. That necropolis still stands to this day. I hope you enjoyed this edition of the Not So Important Times in History. It was brought to you by Gladys Goodies, great treats for your dog to eat. Hey, that was episode number 486, and Becky Grant, Chad Campbell, Darren Platt, and Mark Nelson helped us out today. I love it when that happens. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find any of the links I mentioned and how to contact us. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. Clicking that follow or like button makes us grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.